Yes, the Rorschach test doesn't work. It really doesn't work. So let's prepare for it. By the end of the video, you should be able to pass the Rorschach test looking like a well-adjusted individual rather than whatever some examiner might infer about you from a test that's effectively reading tea leaves and that outside of a proper specific context has very little to no value. That brings me to preparation is not always productive. If you're working on your mental health and you happen to find a good psychologist who just wants to bring some novelty into your relationship by doing the test with you one day, then I would just kindly ask you to reconsider because in that context, the test has some value. But since it is being used in job interviews, which I think is funny, I think it's only fair that a tutorial how to pass it exists. But I can only do so much. I'm just a person who read a lot of books that were meant for the examiners, and since the test is very unscientific, the details of your assessment will very much depend on whoever is administering the test. Unless you have some very specific response patterns, if you take the test with 10 different people, you are very likely going to get 10 different results. This is not necessarily only meant for the standard Rorschach set of the 10 ink blots. I know there are some off-brand ink stains, but you can still use a large part of this video to learn what's primarily expected of your answers. Also, you will not be able to mask everything by preparing your responses on the test. If you have some severe mental health condition, then unless the person administering the test has zero people skills, they're probably going to be able to tell anyway. Are there right or wrong answers? Yes, a certain kind of responses are expected of a well-adjusted individual. The most basic piece of advice I can give you is maintain a good attitude. This whole test is going to be generalizations. However you approach this test, that's going to be looked at as, this is how this person approaches their entire life. The test has two parts. One is the substance of it, and the other one is an analysis of how you behave during the test and what you do. There are personality aspects that are evaluated on a spectrum, where our goal will be to come out somewhere in the middle, so we are effectively rendering this area of analysis not applicable to us. And then there is the contrast of whether you mention some kind of a response or not, and the absence of a response means that it will not be even considered. For example, there are personality aspects that are attributed to whether you mention a texture response or whether you rotate the cards, but if you do neither, then whatever attributes someone made up, they will not even consider those personality aspects in your evaluation. There are basically two ways in which you can fail the test. One is if you give too few responses, one is if you give too many. If you give too few responses, then you are not giving them any material to evaluate you with, and if you give too many responses, then you would ultimately at some point tick every personality box, so everything would apply to you. The lower boundary of failing the test is, well, it depends on the person administering the test, but anything below 14 and definitely below 10 should fail you. That of course doesn't preclude someone from being very creative with your answers, so don't rely on that. There are no clear instructions on how many responses you should give per ink blot, but if you give too many, you might expect that the examiner would stop you eventually. There are different ways of administering the test, and that includes how to approach the number of responses. One example that could happen is, if you give more than 5 responses on the first ink blot, then the examiner could tell you, let's move on to the next one. But if you give less than 5, and then on the second up to the 10th you give more than 5, then you will not be stopped. And it would only be noted that this was not the usual evaluation because you gave very many responses. If you reject a card and don't respond at all, that could invalidate the test, but doesn't necessarily have to. How is the test evaluated? It's evaluated against a set of responses that are considered normal. There seems to be an international set of normal responses and an American set of normal responses. There's a slight difference between them, not a lot, but there is. But the substance of the responses vary culturally very much. The category of responses, however, is what's evaluated. For example, it would not be map of India, but just map, and not dog, but animal. If you did any research on the test before you came to this video, you may have noticed that there's a number scoring system. Don't let that intimidate you. They just had to make some numbers up so their research looks better in scientific papers. There are different kinds of responses for which you need different parts of ink stains. Whole response, where you incorporate the entire picture. It cannot just be scissors, crab, sailboat. You have to make it into a coherent scene. Then details, where you can either use the separate islands or parts of the main ink stain, should there be one. Then tiny details. I recommend against this one because using them is very rare, so that would mark you as an outlier automatically, basically. And then white spaces. That is a safer mark of creativity, so if you want to come out as somewhat creative, you can use white spaces once or twice. All of this is reality testing, and the assumption is how your brain deals with random content. That is how you deal with reality processing. One of the simplest yet most effective things you can do to check whether your reality processing is fine or within the realms of acceptable according to the test is pick a friend, whoever you consider normal. I know this sounds absurd, but it's the Rorschach test. Pick someone who you consider normal and go through your responses with them. If you are able to convince them to see what you are seeing there, then that means it's a good quality response. It doesn't have to be a popular response for it to be a good quality response. Just make sure that they are not saying, yes, I see it, just to make you happy, and you should be fine. We're going to go through the ink stains now. Try to come up with your own responses. You can then tweak them according to the substance that I'm going to tell you about afterwards. Try to come up with at least 5 responses per ink blot and try to cover both the whole ink stains and the details. Then when you're done, the second part of the test is justifications. You should be able to justify why you see what you see. The primary justification is to be able to outline what you are seeing there, but you can be creative with that one. Just make sure that what you're coming up with isn't totally abstract. Congratulations, the worst part is behind you. Now we are going to go over how you're going to be judged. I'm going to go over the categories of responses and how they are evaluated and how certain extremes would be judged. Keep in mind the reality testing part, that is very important. Do not overdo it with anything. Balance is key. Do not focus on anything in particular too much. Stand by what you said. Stand by what you said. Do not show internal conflict. Remember that how you behave during the test will be evaluated also. And maintain an attitude like you are doing a business presentation. Good, not overly enthusiastic. I would ask myself what belongs to a formal setting and what does not. But showing that you want to be cooperative is very important. Do not take anything that I'm going to be talking about personally. The test does not work, but we are going to accept this test as an unfortunate part of reality and just prepare for it. Do not make jokes, do not make meta-commentary, especially negative jokes. When someone gets convinced that the Rorschach test is valid to use it in a job interview, you're probably not going to convince them that their whole life is wrong with just one negative comment. After you give your initial responses, you are going to then clarify your responses. You're going to go through cards 1 through 10 again, and you're going to talk about your responses. Here they are going to see how you generally talk about and think about things. Depending on the way of evaluation, you might be asked if you saw anything else in the meantime in the card, but that's not necessarily going to happen. So prepare your initial responses where there is already the balance in a way where you mention everything that you're comfortable with during the initial associations. The value of this test lies primarily in the fact that it's not a self-reporting test. It's not likely that you would be objective in a self-reporting test, and this one is hard to prepare for, so other aspects of your personality can shine through that would not necessarily show up in a self-reporting test. One of the most important things that you should see in the ink stains is humans, realistic humans, ideally whole, not just parts, not just likes or heads. The assumption is if you don't see any people at all, then you don't think about other people, and you also don't think about other people as independent entities. So, one of the most basic variables you're going to encounter is the number of responses you give. What does that say about you if you give many responses? Remember, they have to be good quality responses. You could be assessed as cooperative, extroverted, possibly though you may have difficulty controlling yourself. Remember that everything on the Rorschach can be assessed both positively and negatively, so they are basically leaving everything up to the examiner anyway. So don't overdo it. Lower number of responses. You have low level of motivation. You're unproductive, overcontrolled, resistant, distrustful, suspicious, paranoid, perhaps depressed. There's this thing called effective ratio. It supposedly reflects your emotional reactivity, and they get it by dividing the number of responses obtained on the last 3 cards by the number of responses on the first 7 cards. How to solve this, how to come across as balanced in this area, give a few more responses on the colorful cards. It should be easier anyway, as you can go off the color, not just the form, not just the outline or depth of the ink stain when forming your responses. If you have high effective ratio, you are energized when presented with emotional stimuli, or, the opposite. But don't overdo it, just a few more things. If you have low effective ratio, you may not know how to ventilate, you may not be as responsive as most people, you mistrust your feelings, and you are not enthusiastic about activities in life. If you have a high number of whole responses, you are a holistic thinker, you strive to organize to an excessive degree, you are possibly overly ambitious. I think that also depends on how you phrase the question. If you phrase it as ink blood and not ink blood, I think the default will be for people to come up with whole responses, but that's not what the theory says. Definitely do not let the mood of the examiner determine your attitude. They might be nudging you in some particular direction, but then they will completely forget it as they are going to be evaluating your test, and they are going to be looking at it as if they were objective, but they are not. They are a person just like you, and this is a very unscientific test. Low number of whole responses. You are unable to see the entire picture. Who comes up with these? And you are unable to accept ambiguity. This one is kind of true. The issue here is that the tinier details look more like some real things rather than the whole things, because nothing will look exactly like something. There are technically more mistakes in the whole picture, so we are going to have to get over that. Another possible interpretation of a low number of whole responses is you are perfectionistic if you reject the whole response because it is not precisely correct. Detailed responses. Responses focusing on obvious details require less processing effort. So you are supposed to have more detailed responses than whole responses, but only slightly, only a few more. If you have a high number of detailed responses, you have the tendency to emphasize the practical, easy solutions. You are economical. If you do not, you are impractical. You do not take advantage of the easily accomplishable tasks. I also want to mention that popular responses do not only include the whole responses, there are popular responses covering the details as well. Unusual details, those are the very tiny details and white spaces. Either you're a perfectionist or you have an idiosyncratic view of the world. If you want to stand out, I would go for 1 or 2 white spaces, but do not use the very tiny details. If you mention a lot of unusual details, you may be peculiar or unique, inclined to look at the world in a way that is different from the way others look at it, or guarded and mistrustful, and you are trying to minimize ambiguities. And with a high number of white spaces, the interpretation is apparently that you are negativistic and impractical, and you have difficulty recognizing the obvious. White spaces may be a healthy sign of creativity, but don't overdo it, because here's how it could be misinterpreted. High number of white spaces, negativistic, oppositional, rebellious. It may be an asset or liability depending on how it is looked at by the individual, and you may have difficulty sustaining relationships because of your inclination to be contradictory. Low number of white spaces, however, is not interpretable, so this is one of the scores that is not interpreted on a spectrum. Popular responses, how conventional you are. Popular responses on cards 1, 3, 5, and 8 are very common, so the absence of them could be marked as unusual, or rather, it would mark you as an outlier. There are levels to not seeing a response. One is if you don't mention it in your initial associations, then if the examiner asks you in the clarification stage, was there anything else, and you don't say it, then they may suggest, look, a lot of people see a bat here. Do you see it? High number of popular responses. You are conventional, overconforming. You know the expected behavior, and you are likely to comply, and you are not likely to show great independence or original thinking. You are inclined to economize and give only what is needed to complete a task, or you might be exerting an effort to hide personally revealing information. If you have a low number of popular responses, you may be eccentric or may not have a good sense of what's expected of you. Nonconformist, possible maladjustment, creative person. You see how the assessment is very much on the person doing the assessment. Just don't overdo it with anything, and that's the best you can do. Reflections and doubles. So apparently, if you see yourself in the the ink blots, that could mean that you're egocentric. Also, there's this thing called organizational activity. That is how big of an effort took an individual to incorporate everything into a holistic response. How you would determine that in a even semi-objective way, I don't know. Rotations, high number of rotations, flexibility, curiosity, independence, or negativism, inclination to be contradictory, intolerant of the usual social compromises. And again, a low rotation score is not interpretable. But this still seems to be one of the safer uniqueness markers, so if you want to stand out in some way, 1 or 2 rotations of the cards is fine. Just don't do anything in a pattern, or at least not in a pattern that they would notice. Reaction time. Measuring the reaction time has largely been abandoned, but it is possible that you will still encounter it. Make sure that your reaction time is uniform throughout your responses, that you're not taking more time with the colorful cards or with the black and white cards, and you do not have to answer right away. A few seconds is fine. If you take a lot of time with your responses, low energy levels, possible depression, low intellectual ability, confusion, obsessive laboring, overthinking, guardedness, distrust, resistance to the task. If you answer within a few seconds and are uniform with your reaction time, low reaction time is not interpretable. If you take a lot of time with the cards that are in color, possible difficulty with emotional stimuli. Regarding the color and form of the ink blot, they look at how you form responses on the colorful ink blots, whether you focus first on the form or then to color, vice versa, or just the color. Primarily, you should focus on the form, only then mention the color. 1 or 2 responses where you first focus on the color are fine. Definitely don't just focus on the color. That would mean that you're completely emotional and you have no control over it. And definitely don't just name the colors. That is a very unusual response. You should have at least 1 response where you primarily focus on the color because you want to show that you have some emotions. Lambda or pure form responses. The frequency of form responses is important enough that a proportional marker has been developed to assess it efficiently, and that is called lambda. It's an index of the psychological willingness to become involved with ambiguous stimuli, and it's also an index of your supposed control. If you focus a lot on the form, you look at the world in a simplistic way, you may not be willing to see complexities. You are conservative in dealing with self and environment. Therefore, you want to focus on not just the outline informing your responses. And if you overall give a low number of responses and you focus a lot on the form, you might be regarded as defensive and guarded, that you don't want to reveal too much about yourself. Another important part when forming your responses, you must focus on movement. Yes, they are just ink stains, but for example, how did a bat get mid-flight? It's flying, obviously, and that is part of the movement. Don't make it all only about movement, but definitely you have to make this an important part of your responses. There are 3 types of movement: animal, human, and inanimate. These 3 apparently reflect very different inner worlds. The number of human movements you see apparently increases with age, but then plateaus as you get into adulthood. And as you get into adulthood, animal movement shows a small decrease. Since animals are easier to see in the ink stains than humans, you should have these 2 approximately equal. And together, seeing humans and seeing humans in movement are signs of maturity and good adult functioning. Human movement is apparently associated with awareness and interest in your own personal internal affairs. And it's supposedly related to your ability to think in a deliberate way and to delay gratification in order to accomplish a goal. People who see a lot of movement have been thought to have creative imagination and to be good at problem solving. You have inner stability and good levels of empathy with other humans. If you don't see a lot of movement, immature, childish, trouble considering alternatives, functions in a trial and error approach, unable to delay gratification, spontaneous though, showing freedom to act on the spur of the moment, less likely to think things through, and can be associated with ADHD. Animal movement. If you first focus on the form of the animal, then on its movement, that is a form of internal processing that is supposedly available to a person early in life. And then as you mature, movement-focused responses tend to increase. Include movement with both animal and human responses and try to maintain a balance between the 2. Regarding inanimate movement, if you have to mention something inanimate moving, it should be something that you are able to control. But the more you talk about inanimate things moving, the more you are apparently in distress. Active and passive movement. According to the evaluation, it's related to whether you are an independent or dependent personality, but of course research has not corroborated that, as with most things on the test. Try to have more active movement responses, but not too much, only slightly. Texture responses. If you were to mention a lot of texture responses, you might be saying that you have unfulfilled affectional needs. However, if you mention 1 texture response that show that you're more secure in your attachments than people with higher scores. Do not try to look at the cards from afar. That would suggest that you want to distance yourself from events or people in your life. Likewise, do not focus on the shading of the cards. That's part of a very disturbing constellation. Blends. Try to incorporate as many aspects of the card into forming your response as you can. It's going to show how complicated your answer is, how much thought you put into it. Now we're going to go over non-human associations, which taken together give a so-called isolation index. Allegedly, people who focus on these are prone to isolating themselves. It would be any responses related to art, anthropology, blood, explosion, fire, food, and clothing. Mention them a few times if you want, but definitely do not focus on these. One of the more healthy kinds of responses on the test is cooperative movement. Try to include at least 1 of them in your responses. If you give a lot of cooperative movement responses, you are likely to be outgoing and have a positive approach to interpersonal relations. You may be perceived as trustworthy, cooperative, easy to work with. Do not talk about anything abstract, aggressive, and do not substitute colors where there are none. The black and white ink blots, do not talk about any color that isn't there. Remember, as I was mentioning, that this test is basically a reality testing. Definitely do not say that you see both a butterfly and a face. Pick one. Contamination responses are not a healthy sign according to the test. And definitely focus on your clarity of expression. You want to demonstrate that you can communicate effectively with others. And also, communicating clearly means you are coming off as less egocentric, because the assumption is that unless you are communicating clearly, you assume that others can basically read your mind. Don't interpret the pictures too randomly. For example, here I see caterpillars celebrating by the Eiffel Tower. That is, on the one hand, a somewhat creative response, but you should be able to see something that is possible in reality. You don't have to try to come across as too logical. Unless the logic follows naturally, it would be marked as inappropriate logic, so you do not have to try. And definitely focus. Whatever card you are talking about is your primary focus and no other. It is fairly fairly common to include at least one personal experience in the responses, but it's also fairly egocentric, so think about whether you want to mention it. If you are going to follow what I just talked about, you should be fine in regards to the composites and ratios, but I want to re-emphasize that you shouldn't focus on non-human movement, shading, texture, vista, and achromatic color determinants. That means you shouldn't focus on the fact that the things are black and white. This is supposed to determine whether you have anxiety or depression. Now, aspirational index, it's a ratio of hull responses to movement responses. It's supposed to reflect your personal goals and whether you have the resources necessary to achieve them. And there we have it. We just went over the most important parts of the Rorschach test. Yeah, we are done. I hope this video helps someone, and definitely subscribe. If you have a question about something or want to clarify something, by all means ask in the comments. I read so much about this test, so let's put it to good use. It's possible that I will not know everything, but what I will know, I will happily answer.